The notification came at 3:47 a.m. Sarah Mitchell's phone buzzed on the nightstand of her cramped studio apartment, the screen illuminating the water-stained ceiling above her bed. The message was simple, clinical even. "Congratulations! Your listing has received its winning bid. Amount $850,000. Buyer verification complete. Contract execution scheduled for March 15th. Her hands trembled as she read the words again, then again, as if repetition might change their meaning or reveal some hidden clause that would make this all make sense. $850,000. The number seemed obscene, impossible, like something from another universe entirely. Just 6 weeks ago, she'd been standing in the kitchen of her childhood home in Millbrook, Tennessee, population 2,847, watching her father sign the papers that transferred their family farm to the bank. 3 generations of Mitchells, gone in the stroke of a pen. Her mother had died 2 years earlier from cancer, the medical bills forming a mountain of debt that no amount of crop yields could ever summit. And now this. The choice she'd made in desperation, in rage, in a moment of such profound hopelessness that it felt like standing at the edge of a cliff with nothing but wind at her back. She'd posted the listing on an exclusive dark web auction site she'd discovered through a true crime podcast, of all things. The site specialized in what it called unprecedented experiences, and operated in the grey zones of legality across multiple jurisdictions. Her listing was clinical, detached, 26-year-old woman from rural America, college-educated, no history of intimate relationships, seeking serious buyer for first experience, verification available, discretion guaranteed. She'd included a photo of her eyes only, green like her mother's, and a voice recording reading a poem by Mary Oliver. The bids had started at $50,000. Within 72 hours, they'd climbed into 6 figures. The comments section filled with questions, propositions, psychological profiles attempted by strangers. Some messages made her skin crawl. Others seemed almost sad, lonely, human in ways she hadn't expected. But none of that prepared her for what came next. None of it prepared her for Malcolm Chen, the man whose lawyer would call her the following morning to arrange a meeting that would unravel everything she thought she knew about herself, her family, and the real reason someone would pay nearly $1 million for something that, in the end, wasn't really for sale at all. Sarah had always believed she understood the mathematics of desperation. Growing up on a struggling farm teaches you to calculate in terms of survival, how many more seasons before the equipment fails completely, how many more years before the soil gives out, how many more months before the bank's patience runs dry. But standing in the lobby of the Hermitage Hotel in Nashville 3 days after receiving that notification, wearing the only professional outfit she owned, a navy blazer from Target and black pants she'd hemmed herself, she realized that desperation had variables she'd never learned to account for. The lawyer who greeted her wasn't what she expected. Margaret Jo was in her early 50s, with silver-streaked hair cut in a sharp bob, and eyes that seemed to catalogue everything without judgment. She wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Sarah's entire wardrobe, and carried herself with the kind of quiet authority that comes from decades of navigating rooms where she was underestimated. "Miss Mitchell," Margaret said, extending her hand. Her grip was firm, professional. "Thank you for meeting with me. I'm representing Mr. Chen in this matter. Before we proceed, I need to make something absolutely clear. You can walk away from this conversation at any time. No judgment, no consequences. Do you understand?" Sarah nodded, though her throat felt tight. They moved to a private conference room where coffee and pastries were laid out on a sideboard, untouched monuments to normalcy in a profoundly abnormal situation. Margaret pulled out a leather portfolio and opened it with practiced precision. "Mr. Chen is a very private individual," she began. "He's 52 years old, a venture capitalist based in San Francisco, and he's dying. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The doctors give him 6 to 8 months. Sarah's carefully constructed composure cracked. "I don't understand. Why would someone who's dying—" "Because he's not looking for what you think he's looking for," Margaret interrupted gently. "May I be frank with you, Sarah? Mr. Chen has no interest in sex. What he's purchasing, if you'll allow me to use that crude term, is something far more complex. He's buying the right to tell you a story, his story. And in exchange for listening, for bearing witness to it, he's prepared to give you financial security beyond what the auction specified." The numbers Margaret wrote on a legal pad made Sarah's vision swim. The $850,000 was just the beginning. There would be a trust fund, investments, a financial advisor assigned to ensure the money lasted. In total, properly managed, she was looking at enough to pay off her father's debts, buy back the farm, and still have enough left over to live comfortably for years. "What's the catch?" Sarah asked, because in her experience there was always a catch. Margaret's expression softened in a way that seemed almost motherly. "The catch, Sarah, is that you'll have to spend 7 days with him at his estate in Big Sur. You'll have to listen to everything he needs to say. And at the end of those 7 days, you'll have to make a choice that will change your life in ways you cannot possibly anticipate right now." "What kind of choice?" "That," Margaret said, closing the portfolio, "is something only Mr. Chen can explain. But I can tell you this. 15 years ago, a young woman made the same choice you're making now. She agreed to the same terms. And what happened to her? Well, that's part of the story you'll hear." Sarah's pulse quickened. "Where is she now?" "That," Margaret said, "is the right question. And it's exactly why Mr. Chen chose you." The meeting lasted another hour, covering legal details, confidentiality agreements, and logistics. Sarah signed papers that made her feel like she was signing away something fundamental, though she couldn't articulate what. Margaret gave her a phone number for a therapist, which felt both insulting and oddly thoughtful. As Sarah left the hotel, stepping back into the humid Nashville afternoon, she felt like she was watching herself from a distance, a character in someone else's story, moving through beats she couldn't control. She had 2 weeks before she was scheduled to fly to California. 2 weeks to tell her father, who still called her every Sunday from the assisted living facility where he now lived, that she'd found a way to save everything they'd lost. 2 weeks to convince herself that she wasn't making a terrible mistake. 2 weeks before she'd meet Malcolm Chen and discover that some auctions aren't about what's being sold at all, but about what the buyer has already lost and is desperately, impossibly trying to find again. The estate in Big Sur was not what Sarah expected. Perched on cliffs overlooking the Pacific, the modernist structure seemed to grow from the rock itself, all glass and weathered wood and angles that defied convention. The drive from the airport had taken 3 hours, winding through landscapes that shifted from urban sprawl to redwood forest to coastal grandeur. Margaret had made the journey with her, maintaining a professional silence that Sarah appreciated. As they pulled up the private drive, Sarah saw him for the first time. Malcolm Chen stood on a terrace that jutted out over the ocean, a slight figure in jeans and a cream-colored sweater, hands in his pockets facing the water. Even from a distance, she could see the disease in the way he held himself, careful, as if his body were something borrowed that might break without warning. He turned as they approached, and Sarah was struck by his face. Gaunt, yes, with the hollow-cheeked look of someone losing weight they couldn't afford to lose, but his eyes were intensely alive, dark and searching. He smiled, and it transformed him into someone younger, someone who hadn't yet learned that he was dying. "Sarah," he said, his voice surprisingly strong, "thank you for coming. I know this must seem bizarre beyond measure." She shook his extended hand, surprised by its warmth. Mr. Chen. Malcolm, please. Mr. Chen makes me sound like my father, and he was an asshole. The candor startled a laugh out of her. Margaret excused herself, promising to return in a week, and suddenly Sarah was alone with a dying stranger who'd paid a fortune for something neither of them could quite name. Malcolm gestured toward the house. Let me show you around. Your suite is on the second floor, overlooking the ocean. Privacy, comfort, your own space. I want you to feel like this is a retreat, not a prison. The interior was stunning. Art on the walls that Sarah recognized from her college humanities courses, furniture that managed to be both austere and inviting, and everywhere, books. Thousands of them, lining walls, stacked on tables, forming columns in corners. I was an English major before business school corrupted me, Malcolm said, following her gaze. Never quite recovered. Her suite was larger than her entire apartment back home, with floor-to-ceiling windows framing the endless Pacific. A desk held a laptop, notebooks, pens, tools for thought should she need them. Fresh flowers stood in a vase on the dresser. Dinner is at 7, Malcolm said from the doorway. Casual, just us. And Sarah, if at any point you want to leave, just say the word. The money is yours regardless. This isn't a transaction where I hold anything hostage. I need you to believe that. After he left, Sarah sat on the edge of the bed, trying to process everything. The room smelled of lavender and ocean salt. Through the window, she could see pelicans diving into the surf, their bodies arrows of purpose. She thought of her father in his small room in Tennessee, playing chess with other residents, pretending he wasn't haunted by the loss of the land. She thought of her mother's grave, back behind the old oak tree, marked with a stone they'd paid for with the last of the farm's equity. And she thought of herself at 16, lying in the hay loft during a summer storm, making promises about the person she'd become, the life she'd live, the difference she'd make. None of those promises had included this. Dinner was surprisingly normal. Malcolm had cooked pasta with fresh vegetables, bread from a local bakery, wine that tasted like it cost more than her car. They talked about safe things, her drive up the coast, the weather, books they'd both read. He was funny, self-deprecating, curious. He asked about her studies. She'd majored in environmental science before dropping out to help with the farm, and listened with genuine interest. It wasn't until they'd moved to the living room, coffee in hand, that the mood shifted. Malcolm settled into a chair by the fireplace, where flames provided the only light beyond the purple dusk filtering through the windows. "I should tell you about Emily," he said. "The woman Margaret mentioned. The one who was here 15 years ago." Sarah set down her coffee, her full attention on him now. She was 23, a graduate student in philosophy who'd posted a listing similar to yours, though the internet was different then, the venues more primitive. "I was 37, recently divorced, angry at the world, and convinced I could purchase anything, including something as abstract as innocence." He paused, staring into the fire. "I was wrong about nearly everything, but I was right about one thing. Emily changed my life, just not in any way I could have predicted." "What happened?" Sarah asked. Malcolm looked at her, his expression unreadable. "That's the story I need to tell you. All of it. Every detail. Every consequence. Because 15 years ago, I made Emily an offer at the end of our 7 days together. She accepted, and 3 years later, she disappeared. No trace, no explanation. Just gone. And I've spent the last 12 years trying to understand why, trying to find her, trying to make sense of a choice that seemed right at the time, but may have been the greatest mistake of my life." The room suddenly felt colder. "You think I'm her," Sarah said, the realization arriving fully formed. "You think I'm Emily?" "No," Malcolm said softly, "but I think you might be able to tell me what happened to her. Because there are things about you, Sarah Mitchell from Millbrook, Tennessee, that don't quite add up. And I've learned that when things don't add up, It's because someone is solving a different equation entirely. The first full day at the estate, Malcolm told Sarah about his life before Emily. He'd grown up in San Francisco's Chinatown, the son of immigrants who'd built a successful import business through decades of brutal work. His father had wanted him to join the family company, but Malcolm had other ambitions. He'd gone to Stanford, then business school, then into venture capital, at a time when the internet was still finding its shape. By his early 30s, he'd made his first fortune, then his second. He'd married a woman named Jessica, a lawyer with a sharp mind and sharper tongue. They'd had what looked from the outside like a perfect life. Penthouse in Pacific Heights, vacation home in Napa, invitations to the right parties, investments in the right startups. But I was empty, Malcolm said. They were walking the coastal trail behind the estate, moving slowly to accommodate his diminished stamina. Success is supposed to fill something in you, but for me, it just hollowed me out further. Jessica knew it. We'd lie in bed at night, two people who'd achieved everything we were supposed to want, and feel absolutely nothing. The divorce had been amicable, expensive, and liberating. Malcolm sold the penthouse, bought this estate, and spent a year doing nothing but reading and staring at the ocean. It was during that time that he'd stumbled onto the auction site, initially out of morbid curiosity, then with growing fascination. I'd convinced myself I was anthropological about it, he said, studying human desperation, the economics of intimacy, the way late-stage capitalism turns everything into commodity. I was full of shit, of course. What I was really doing was looking for someone who felt as empty as I did, hoping that shared emptiness might somehow become fullness. Emily's listing had been different from the others. Poetic, philosophical, honest in a way that cut through the transactional language. She'd quoted Kierkegaard, "Life can only be understood backwards, but it must be lived forwards." Malcolm had placed the first bid almost impulsively, then kept bidding as others joined, driven by something he couldn't name. When he won, he'd felt not triumph, but terror. "She arrived on a day much like this one," he said, gesturing at the perfect California afternoon around them. Nervous, but trying to hide it. We had dinner, we talked. And by the end of that first evening, I knew I didn't want what I'd thought I wanted. I wanted to know her, really know her. Not possess or consume, but understand. Over the next week, Malcolm had learned Emily's story. She'd grown up in rural Oregon, in a family that valued faith over education. She'd fought her way to college, then graduate school, accumulating debt and alienating her family in the process. Philosophy had been her sanctuary, a place where questions mattered more than answers. But graduate school had also been isolating, competitive, cruel in its own academic way. She'd posted the listing in a moment of desperation similar to Sarah's, though her debts were educational rather than medical. The thing about Emily, Malcolm said, was that she saw through everything. Every pretense, every social performance, every comfortable lie. It was exhausting and exhilarating. We'd spend hours debating ideas, arguing about books, dissecting movies. Sex never came up. It seemed beside the point. Sarah found herself engrossed, walking beside this dying man as he excavated his past. She recognized something in his description of Emily. That particular loneliness of intelligent women from nowhere, women whose minds took them places their backgrounds never prepared them for. "On the last day," Malcolm continued, "I made her an offer. I told her I'd set up a foundation dedicated to making philosophy accessible to people outside academia, not dumbed down, but democratized. Lectures, books, online courses, all free. I'd fund it entirely, asking nothing in return. But I wanted her to run it, to be the face and mind of it, to take everything she knew and share it with people who'd never otherwise encounter it." They'd reached a bench overlooking the ocean. Malcolm sat heavily, his breathing labored. Sarah sat beside him, waiting. She said yes, he said. Of course she said yes. It was everything she'd dreamed of. We spent 6 months setting it up, renting office space in Berkeley, hiring staff, designing curriculum. Emily was brilliant at it. She could take Heidegger or Sartre or Wittgenstein and make them feel urgent, relevant, necessary. The courses launched, thousands enrolled. It was working. But then she disappeared, Sarah said. Malcolm nodded. 3 years in. At the height of the foundation's success, she'd just given a lecture series that had gone viral, reaching millions. She had book offers, speaking engagements, genuine impact. And then, one Monday morning, she didn't show up for work. Her apartment was empty, cleaned out. No note, no email, no phone call, just gone. What did the police say? That adults have the right to disappear. They investigated briefly. No signs of foul play, no suspicious activity. Her bank accounts remained untouched. It was as if she'd evaporated. Malcolm's voice cracked. For 12 years, I've wondered. Did I trap her in a different way? Was the foundation just another cage? Did she feel obligated to me because of where we'd started? Or did something else happen? Something darker? Sarah felt a chill despite the warm sun. And you think I can help you understand? Malcolm turned to face her fully. Sarah, when my lawyers vetted your background, some things didn't match up. The timeline of your mother's illness, the specifics of your father's farm debt, the college you said you attended has no record of you. The apartment you're renting is paid for by a trust you didn't establish. Someone has been carefully constructing your identity, making you look like exactly the kind of person who would make exactly the choice you made. The world seemed to tilt. That's impossible. I know who I am. My memories are incredibly powerful, Malcolm interrupted gently. But memories can be shaped, Sarah, especially if someone has access, time, and motivation. I think Emily found you. I think she's been preparing you, and I think the choice I'm about to offer you at the end of this week is exactly what she wants you to accept. The question is, why? Sarah spent that night unable to sleep, Malcolm's words circling her mind like birds of prey. She opened her laptop and began searching for herself, really searching, with the kind of desperate focus she'd never brought to bear before. The inconsistencies were small, but undeniable once she looked for them. Photos of her childhood home showed slightly different features than her memories suggested. Her high school yearbook, which she found archived online, included her picture, but the caption had been edited. She could see the digital artifacts around her name. The farm her father supposedly lost, its deed history showed a gap, a period of 3 years where ownership was unclear, held in a trust with a name she didn't recognize. She called her father. It was late in Tennessee, but he answered on the second ring, his voice thick with sleep and medication. Sarah, honey, what's wrong? Dad, I need you to tell me about Mom's cancer. When exactly was she diagnosed? There was a long pause. Too long. Dad? Sarah, you know this. Why are you asking? Please, just tell me. Another pause. Then, your mother died when you were 8 years old, honey, in a car accident. There was no cancer. We've talked about this with your doctors. The memories you have of her being sick, of taking care of her during treatment, those aren't real. They're what your mind created to cope with the trauma. The phone slipped from Sarah's hand, clattering on the desk. Her breathing came in short gasps. The room spun. Everything she remembered about the last 2 years, her mother's illness, the medical bills, the slow dissolution of hope, felt absolutely real, solid, unmovable. But her father's voice had carried the weight of truth, the exhaustion of having this conversation before. She picked up the phone. What doctors? The ones at the hospital after your breakdown. Sarah, you spent 6 months in treatment 3 years ago. We thought you were better. The farm was never in debt. I sold it because I couldn't manage it alone anymore, because you needed help I couldn't afford without liquidating. Please tell me you're taking your medications." Sarah ended the call. She stood and began pacing the room, her mind fracturing and reassembling with each step. Either her father was lying, part of some elaborate conspiracy, or her entire understanding of herself was built on false foundations. She thought of Emily, the brilliant philosopher who'd seen through everything. What had she seen in Sarah? Why would she spend years constructing an alternative identity for a stranger? The laptop on the desk caught her eye. In her frantic searching, she'd left open a page about dissociative identity disorder, about how trauma could create elaborate false memories, entire false lives. But also open was a page about experimental psychology, about how memory could be artificially implanted, about the ethics of identity construction in the digital age. Two explanations, each as terrifying as the other. Sarah opened a new browser window and typed, "Emily Clark, philosopher, disappeared." The results were immediate. Articles about the mysterious disappearance, speculation about what had happened, theories ranging from foul play to voluntary exit. Photos showed a woman in her 20s, dark hair, intense eyes, lecturing to rapt audiences. And in one photo, taken at a philosophy conference, Emily stood beside another woman, their heads close together, sharing some private joke. The caption read, "Dr. Emily Clark with conference organizer Dr. Miranda Mitchell." Sarah's vision narrowed to that name. Mitchell, her supposed last name. She clicked through to Dr. Miranda Mitchell's profile. A philosopher specializing in personal identity, the self, the nature of consciousness, published widely, taught at Berkeley, and most relevant, vanished from academic life 12 years ago, the same time Emily disappeared. The photo showed a woman with green eyes like Sarah's, a face that could have been Sarah's mother's or Sarah's in 20 years, depending on how you looked at it. Sarah's hands shook as she screamed. Malcolm found her on the terrace at dawn, wrapped in a blanket, staring at the ocean with eyes that had seen too much. He brought coffee and sat beside her without speaking, waiting. Finally, Sarah said, "Tell me what you really know." "I know that Emily disappeared with a woman named Miranda Mitchell, who may or may not be your mother, aunt, or someone else entirely. I know they emptied the Foundation's research accounts, not the operating funds, just the research money, about $2 million. I know they went underground completely, leaving no digital footprint at all, which requires both skill and resources. And I know that 3 years ago, a young woman matching your description was admitted to a psychiatric hospital in Tennessee after a complete psychological break triggered by her mother's death in a car accident." He paused, sipping his coffee. "I also know that the attending psychiatrist at that hospital was a doctor, Richard Chen, my cousin, who contacted me about an unusual case, a patient whose memories seemed to have been systematically altered, not by mental illness, but by external intervention. Someone had been working on your mind, Sarah, for years, carefully building a false narrative that would lead you to make exactly the choice you made." Sarah felt strangely calm now, past terror into something like clarity. "Why? That's what I need you to help me understand. Because I think Emily and Miranda aren't villains in this story. I think they're trying to save you from something, or save someone else through you. And I think the choice I'm about to offer you is exactly what they've been preparing you to make." "What choice?" Sarah asked. Malcolm reached into his pocket and pulled out a small envelope. "In here is information about a program Emily and Miranda have been running underground. Using techniques borrowed from psychology, neuroscience, and philosophy, they help women reconstruct their identities after trauma. Not by erasing the past, but by giving them the tools to choose which version of themselves to become." It's controversial, possibly illegal, certainly unethical by conventional standards, but it works. He held out the envelope. The choice is this. You can take this, learn where they are, join them in their work. You'll have to leave your life behind, including your father, including any certainty about who you were. Or you can take the money, go back to Tennessee, try to rebuild from what you know is true versus what was planted. Either way, you walk away from here. But only one path gives you the chance to understand what Emily understood, what Miranda knows, what they saw in you that made them willing to risk everything to reach you. Sarah took the envelope, but didn't open it. And if I choose to find them, then you'll discover whether the woman you think you are is real or constructed, and you'll have to decide if that distinction even matters. They sat in silence as the sun rose higher, painting the ocean in shades of gold and copper. Sarah thought about identity, about memory, about the stories we tell ourselves to survive. She thought about her father, whichever version of him was real, and whether love required truth or just persistence. Most of all, she thought about Emily, brilliant and desperate Emily, who'd taken Malcolm's money and then taken something far more valuable, her own narrative back. "There's one more thing," Malcolm said. "The foundation Emily built, it's still running. The staff she hired kept it going after she vanished. Over the years, it's helped hundreds of thousands of people access philosophy, think more clearly, question more deeply. Her disappearance didn't destroy what she built. It just removed her from its center." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that sometimes the greatest gift is not presence, but the space we leave behind. Emily gave me purpose by leaving. She forced me to stop trying to own or control and instead to serve something larger. The foundation thrived because she wasn't there to limit it to her vision." He stood, slowly, painfully. "This is my last story to tell you, Sarah. After this, you decide. But I need you to know that 15 years ago, I thought I was buying something. Instead, I was being offered a chance to grow up, to stop treating life as a series of transactions and start treating it as a series of gifts. Emily was my teacher, though I was supposed to be her patron, and I think you're being offered the same opportunity, just in reverse." "What do you mean?" Sarah asked. "I think Miranda and Emily have been preparing you to be someone's teacher. Someone who needs exactly what you can offer. A perspective from outside, a willingness to question everything, and the strength that comes from surviving your own unraveling. The question is whether you're brave enough to accept that role, even though you don't fully understand who you are yet." The remaining days passed in a blur of conversation and silence, revelation and reflection. Malcolm told Sarah everything he knew about Emily's research, about the techniques used to reshape memory and identity, about the ethical debates that had raged in academic circles before Emily and Miranda disappeared. He showed her papers they'd published under pseudonyms, studies that pushed the boundaries of what science thought possible about consciousness and self. Sarah read them all, her background in environmental science giving her just enough grounding in research methodology to follow the arguments. What Emily and Miranda proposed was radical. That identity was not a fixed thing discovered, but a fluid thing created, that trauma could be not just healed but transformed, that the stories we tell about ourselves matter more than the facts underlying them. "But that can't be right," Sarah argued on the 5th day. "Facts matter. Truth matters. You can't just decide you're someone different and make it so." "Can't you?" Malcolm countered. They were in his library, surrounded by books that represented centuries of humans trying to understand themselves. "You've spent this week discovering that many of your memories are false. Does that make your emotions less real? Does that make you less Sarah?" "It makes me less sure of who Sarah is," she said. "Exactly. And that uncertainty is where freedom lives. As long as you think you know who you are, you're trapped by that knowledge. But once you accept that identity is always provisional, always under construction, then you can choose who to become. Sarah thought about this, about her father in Tennessee playing chess with strangers, about her mother, whichever version of her had actually existed, about the farm that may or may not have been lost to debt, about the life she remembered living, which felt real in every way that mattered except factually. "How do I know I'm not just crazy?" she asked. Malcolm smiled. "Who says those are different things? Maybe sanity is just agreed-upon delusion. Maybe what Emily and Miranda discovered is that we're all crazy, all constructing ourselves from moment to moment, and the only difference is whether we do it consciously or unconsciously." On the 6th day, Malcolm's health took a turn. He spent most of the day in bed, his body finally catching up to the disease that had been slowly claiming it. Sarah sat with him, reading aloud from books he requested: Marcus Aurelius, Montaigne, Adrienne Rich, James Baldwin. Writers who'd grappled with identity and mortality, who'd found in that grappling something like wisdom. "I'm not afraid of dying," Malcolm said during a lucid moment. "I'm afraid of dying without understanding. Emily taught me that. She showed me that a life examined, really examined, is worth all the uncertainty and pain." "Did you love her?" Sarah asked. Malcolm considered this. "I loved who I became around her, which maybe isn't the same thing, but maybe is the only thing that matters. She was a mirror that showed me myself clearly for the first time, harsh but clear." "Is that what you think I am for someone else?" Sarah asked. "A mirror?" "I think you're a door," Malcolm said. "The question is whether you'll open it." On the 7th day, Malcolm rallied enough to join Sarah for breakfast on the terrace. Margaret had arrived the night before, prepared to facilitate whatever Sarah decided. The envelope sat between them on the table, still unopened. "I've made my choice," Sarah said. Malcolm nodded, unsurprised. "Before you tell me, I want you to know something. The money is yours regardless. The foundation will continue. And everything I've told you this week is true, as far as I understand truth. But I'm also a dying man desperate for meaning, so take it all with appropriate skepticism." Sarah smiled. "That's very philosophical of you. Emily would be proud." She opened the envelope. Inside was an address in New Mexico, coordinates for a place not on any map, a phone number, and a photograph of two women standing in front of an adobe building, their arms around each other, both smiling with the kind of joy that comes from hard-won freedom. She recognized Emily from the photos she'd found online. The other woman, older but unmistakable, had green eyes like Sarah's. "I'm going to find them," Sarah said, "but not because I think they have answers, because I think they have better questions." Malcolm leaned back in his chair, his face peaceful. "What will you tell your father?" "The truth. That I'm going to discover who I am, which might mean discovering I'm someone different than he thought. But that I love him. Whichever version of him loved, whichever version of me. And if you find Emily and Miranda and discover you don't like what they're doing," Sarah folded the paper carefully, "then I'll walk away. But at least I'll walk away knowing I chose to look, rather than spending my life wondering what I missed." They sat in silence, watching the ocean. After a while, Malcolm said, "You know what I think happened to Emily? I think she realized that the foundation, for all its good, was still binding her to a narrative someone else had started. She needed to step away, not because it was wrong, but because it was mine, and I think she's been building something new, something that's entirely hers, with Miranda, something that requires people willing to question everything, including themselves." "And you're okay with that?" Sarah asked. "With never seeing her again, never knowing for certain?" Malcolm smiled. "I'm dying, Sarah. I'll know soon enough, or I won't know anything at all. Either way, I'm at peace. Emily gave me that gift, the ability to let go." Margaret drove Sarah to the airport the next day. Malcolm was too weak to come down, but he'd left a note. Don't forget, we're all making it up as we go. The brave ones just admit it. As the plane lifted off, Sarah looked down at the coastline receding beneath her, at the estate perched on its cliffs, at the vast Pacific stretching to horizons she'd never seen. In her bag was Malcolm's envelope, nearly $1 million in carefully structured accounts, and a burner phone for the number she wasn't sure she'd call. She thought about the auction that had started all this, the desperate choice that had seemed like selling something precious. Now it felt more like she'd purchased something instead, a chance to reconstruct herself deliberately, to choose which memories to believe, which story to tell, which version of Sarah Mitchell to become. The truth was, she'd been making this choice all along. Every day, everyone chooses who to be, which aspects of their past to emphasize, which to minimize, which to simply invent. Most people just don't acknowledge it. Emily and Miranda had simply made the process conscious, explicit, available. The plane banked west, and Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the subtle shift as they changed direction. Toward New Mexico, toward questions without answers, toward women who'd looked at the architectures of identity and decided to become architects themselves, building new selves from the rubble of old traumas. Malcolm had been right. She was a door. The question was never whether she'd open. It was what she'd find on the other side, and whether she'd have the courage to walk through, even if the view terrified her. 3 months later, a package arrived at Malcolm Chen's estate. Inside was a single page, handwritten. "Thank you for teaching me how to disappear. Emily was right about you. You were always better at seeing than holding. The woman you knew as Sarah is gone. Someone new is here instead, someone I chose to become. Tell the Foundation to keep teaching philosophy to people who need it. Not because it has answers, but because it teaches us to live in questions. That's the only home any of us really have." It was unsigned, but Malcolm recognized the handwriting from documents Sarah had signed during their week together. He read it twice, then carried it to his study and placed it in a box with other precious things. A letter from Emily he'd received years after her disappearance, a photograph of his mother, a stone from the beach below the house. Things that mattered not because they were fully understood, but because they represented moments when understanding seemed less important than wonder. He died 3 weeks later, peacefully in his sleep. The Foundation received an anonymous donation that same day, enough to fund its operations for another decade. The staff, none of whom had ever met Malcolm in person, continued their work teaching philosophy to people who'd never set foot in a university, never imagined that questions about existence and meaning and identity were theirs to ask. In the years that followed, rumors circulated in certain circles about a program in the desert Southwest, a place where women went to reconstruct themselves after trauma. No one could verify its existence. No addresses appeared in any database, but occasionally someone would mention meeting a woman who seemed to have appeared from nowhere, with a past that didn't quite track, but a presence that felt absolutely real, absolutely chosen. Sarah Mitchell's father lived another 8 years. The farm debt he'd thought would consume his final days vanished mysteriously, paid off by an anonymous trust. He spent his remaining time in comfort, playing chess and telling stories about his daughter to anyone who'd listen. Sometimes the stories contradicted each other. In some versions, she'd died young in a car accident. In others, she was traveling the world. In still others, she was doing important work he couldn't quite explain. He never seemed troubled by these contradictions. Perhaps he understood, in the way parents sometimes do, that children are always multiple things, always becoming, always more than any single story can contain. The auction site where Sarah had posted her listing was shut down by international law enforcement 2 years after her transaction with Malcolm. Dozens of people were arrested. Hundreds of listings were traced, investigated, resulting in prosecutions for trafficking, exploitation, and abuse. Sarah's listing was among those examined, but the investigators found something strange. The transaction had been legitimate in every technical sense. No coercion, no exploitation, just two adults making an unconventional exchange that somehow transcended its sordid origins. One investigator, a woman named Chen, no relation to Malcolm, though the coincidence made her think, kept the file open longer than she should have. Something about it nagged at her, the way the money had been structured. The psychological evaluations that had been conducted, sophisticated beyond what any normal transaction would require. The careful attention to ensuring genuine consent at every stage. It read less like exploitation and more like rescue. Like someone had used the apparatus of commodification to save someone from drowning, then disappeared before credit could be claimed or questions asked. She closed the file eventually, marking it resolved. But sometimes, late at night, when she was working on other cases, other women trapped in situations they couldn't escape, she wondered about Sarah Mitchell, about whether there were more women like her, women who'd been given the chance to become someone new, and whether that was salvation or just another form of erasure, and whether the difference mattered if the women themselves chose it. In New Mexico, in a compound that didn't appear on satellite images, a woman who'd once been called Sarah stood before a group of newcomers. 15 women, all younger than 30, all carrying trauma that had fractured their sense of self. She didn't use the name Sarah anymore. She'd chosen something new, something that felt more true. Kira, meaning light in some languages, dark in others, which seemed appropriate for someone who lived in the space between who she'd been and who she'd decided to become. Identity is not discovered, she told them, repeating words Miranda had taught her, words Emily had discovered through years of research and lived experience. It's authored, and you are the authors of yourselves. Everything that happened to you is real. But the story you tell about what it means, that's yours to write. She looked at their faces, seeing the same fear and hope she'd felt sitting across from Malcolm in Big Sur, seeing the same desperate hunger for a way forward that didn't require forgetting, but did require fundamental change. Behind her, Miranda and Emily watched, their partnership now in its third decade, their methods refined but their mission unchanged, helping women trapped in narratives not of their choosing to write new chapters. Kira thought about Malcolm often, especially on days when the work felt overwhelming, when she questioned whether what they were doing was healing or harm, liberation or manipulation. She'd learned that such questions didn't have answers, only responses, only choices made in specific moments with specific people. Malcolm had understood that. He'd paid for something he thought he wanted and received instead something he actually needed. The chance to witness transformation without controlling it, to facilitate freedom without possessing it. The money he'd given her had seeded this work, funding the compound, the research, the careful legal structures that kept them operating in grey zones authorities couldn't quite reach or quite condemn. But more valuable than the money was the example he'd set. How to hold something precious lightly, how to invest in outcomes you'd never see, how to die knowing you'd contributed to questions rather than claiming to possess answers. That night, after the newcomers had gone to their rooms to process what they'd learned, Kira stood outside looking at stars that seemed impossibly bright in the desert darkness. She thought about the auction, about the moment she'd posted that listing, convinced she was selling something. Now she understood she'd been buying time, buying possibility, buying the space to become someone she'd never imagined. Somewhere in Tennessee, her father was sleeping, dreaming whatever dreams old men dream. Somewhere in California, Malcolm's estate stood empty, preserved as a retreat for philosophy students who needed space to think. Somewhere in the digital archives, records of Sarah Mitchell existed, incomplete and contradictory, a life half-lived and half-imagined. But here, in the desert, under stars that had witnessed countless transformations, Kira existed fully. Not because she knew who she was, but because she'd accepted that who she was would always be a question she was still answering. Malcolm had bought the right to tell her a story. Emily had bought her freedom to create new ones. And she'd paid for it all with the only currency that ultimately mattered: the willingness to let everything she thought she knew dissolve and reform into something stranger, truer, and entirely her own. The auction had never been about virginity or money or even identity in any conventional sense. It had been about what happens when desperation meets possibility, when people trapped by circumstances beyond their control encounter others who understand that control itself is the illusion we need to transcend. Malcolm, Emily, Miranda, and now Kira, all of them had learned the same lesson, just from different angles. We are not what happens to us. We are what we choose to make of what happens to us. And sometimes, the most radical choice is not to fight the stories others have written about us, but to acknowledge those stories as one version among many, then write new ones that feel more true, even if they're no more factual. Truth, they'd all discovered, was less about correspondence to external reality and more about coherence with internal necessity. We are true when we are fully ourselves, whoever that self happens to be in this moment, in this version, in this iteration of the endless story we tell about our own becoming. Kira went inside, back to the work, back to the women who needed what she and Emily and Miranda could offer. Not answers, not certainty, not even healing in any conventional sense, but permission. Permission to be multiple, contradictory, evolving. Permission to author themselves deliberately, rather than accepting the authorship of trauma, history, or circumstance. The auction had been her beginning. But it turned out what she'd auctioned wasn't what anyone thought. Not her body, not her innocence, not even her identity. What she'd auctioned was her certainty about who she was, and what she'd received in return was the freedom to never be certain again. It was the best bargain she'd ever made, though it had cost her everything she'd thought she was to discover everything she could become. And somewhere, in whatever comes after, Malcolm Chen was smiling, understanding finally what Emily had tried to teach him 15 years ago. The greatest gift we can give each other is not our presence or our possessions, but our willingness to witness each other's transformations without needing to direct them. Love, real love, looks like letting go, and freedom, real freedom, feels like falling until you realize you've been flying all along. Thanks for watching this incredible story. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like it and subscribe to the channel. Here at Heartfelt Storytime, you have new, beautiful stories every day. Don't miss out. See you next time.